The first rays of sunlight peeked through the curtains, but Mayan hadn't slept well. She was too scared. Sharing a bed with Jungkook, the mafia boss she had just married, made her heart race with fear. She thought he might hurt her if she made a mistake. When she woke up, her head hurt. Slowly, she got out of bed and walked towards the bathroom. But on the way, her wrist hit the corner of the table. She gasped softly. Blood started to drip from the cut on her waist. The sound made Jungkook wake up. He made a sleepy noise and turned over. He mumbled in his sleep. Wine froze, her heart pounding. Wine. Sorry, she whispered, hoping he wouldn't be angry. She tried to leave the room quietly, but then she heard him mumble again in his sleep. Jungkook. Coffee. She stopped. Did he just ask for coffee? She wasn't sure, but she didn't want to take any chances. She ignored the pain in her wrist and hurried to the kitchen to make him coffee. When she came back with the coffee, Jungkook was sitting up in bed. His messy hair made him look less scary, but his sharp eyes made her nervous. He looked up at her as she went close to him to give him the cup of coffee. He looked at her for a few seconds as he realized that he was married and he just slept with a wife. He even forgot that. He took the cup from her hand and said, "Thank you. Did I accidentally ask you for coffee in my sleep?" "Wine. You did," she said, looking downward. Uncle. "Sorry, I thought it was the maid as usual." Then he frowned as he looked at the coffee. "Why is there milk in this? I'm allergic to milk." "Wine. I didn't know." Wine said softly, staring at the floor. Uncle. "Why did you make it yourself? You could have asked a maid." He asked, confused. "Wine. I thought you told me to." She explained quickly. He blinked, then rubbed his face. Jungkook sighed. "Forget it. It was my mistake anyway." He put the cup on the table, and then his eyes fell on her hand. His frown deepened. "Jungkook, what happened to your wrist?" he asked. His voice was serious. Wine quickly hid her hand behind her back. "Wine. It's nothing." "Jungkook, show me," he said, sounding more firm this time. Slowly, she showed him her hand. The cut was still bleeding a little. "Jungkook, you hurt yourself and still made coffee for me?" he asked, his voice rising. "Wine. I didn't want to." "Jungkook, wait," he said, cutting her off. His tone softened as he hurriedly took her hand in his. "Jungkook, you should have taken care of this first." He looked at it for a few seconds with worried eyes. Jungkook left the room and came back with a first aid kit. He sat beside her and gently cleaned her wound. "Jungkook, this might hurt a little," he said softly. Wine winced as he dabbed at the cut, but his hands were gentle. He wrapped her wrist with a bandage, making sure it was secure, while she looked at him, confused and relieved at the same time. The fear of him in her heart was fading little by little. "Jungkook, you need to be more careful," he said, looking straight at her. "Jungkook, you're my wife now. If something happens to you, I'll be very worried." Ryan stared at him, surprised. His voice didn't sound scary now. It sounded kind. "Fine. Okay," she whispered. Jungkook was working on his laptop while sitting on the couch with his specs on. He couldn't focus much on his work as Vine, who was sitting across from him, fidgeted on the couch, her eyes moving nervously around the room. She looked unsure, like she didn't know what to do with herself. "Jungkook, You don't have to sit there all day, he said, breaking the silence. Wine flinched slightly at his voice. Wine. I don't know what else to do, she admitted quietly. Jungkook sighed and stood up, walking toward her. Jungkook, you're free to do whatever you want, Wine. This is your home now. She blinked, clearly startled by his words. My home? Jungkook, yes, your home, not a prison. You're not here to work or serve me. If you want to rest, rest. If you want to walk in the garden, go ahead. You don't need my permission. Vine nodded, but the uncertain look in her eyes lingered. Jungkook noticed and frowned. He crouched down in front of her, meeting her gaze directly. Jungkook, you don't trust me, do you? Her eyes widened. She quickly looked away, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Vine, it's not that. I just. Jungkook leaned back, giving her some space. Jungkook, you think I'm like the stories you've heard, don't you? That I'd hurt you if you upset me. Her silence was answer enough. He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. Jungkook, mine. I only hurt people who try to hurt me or the people I care about. Well, you're my wife now. That means you're someone I care about too. If someone even lays an eye on you, he's my enemy, not you. You will never be one. He took her hand in his and looked in her eyes. Jungkook, I care about you too, Vine. Her gaze flickered to him, searching his face as if trying to decide if he was telling the truth. She wasn't sure whether to trust him or not, and the way she was staring at him, he knew that she was doubtful. He put off his glasses, hanging them at his collar, and stood up while holding her hand. Jungkook, come with me. She didn't refuse him. She stood up and he took her outside, toward the garden. They walked in silence at first. The cool breeze was rustling the leaves and her hair. She felt so fresh after a long time. She finally was able to breathe properly, and he made her comfortable around him. She couldn't stop admiring the beauty of the garden. Vine stopped near a bed of roses, admiring their deep red color. Jungkook, you like roses? Their hands were still in each other. She nodded. They are beautiful. He reached down, plucking one of the roses carefully. He handed it to her, a small smile tugged at his lips. Vine looked at it for a few seconds in shock, and then she took it, her heart fluttering slightly. Vine, thank you. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Jungkook only smiled in answer. The rose that Jungkook gave her stayed on her mind long after their walk in the garden. It wasn't just a flower. It was the first gift he had given her, and for some reason it felt special. So when lunch came around, Vine decided to wear it in her ear, despite how childish she thought it might look. It wasn't about appearances, it was about the meaning behind it. As she entered the dining room, Jungkook looked up from where he was already seated at the table. His gaze instantly landed on the flower in her hair, and a small chuckle escaped her lips. Jungkook, you're wearing it? He asked, a teasing grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Vine felt her cheeks warm as she nervously touched the flower, trying to act casual. Vine, I like it. Is that strange? Jungkook watched her, his eyes softening as he hid his smile. She looked beautiful, even with something as simple as a rose in her ear. Her nervousness only made her look more charming. His heart couldn't help but flutter a bit too much. Jungkook, no, it's just cute, he said, his voice a little quieter than usual. He quickly looked away, trying to hide the blush creeping up his neck. Wine felt a small rush of happiness at his words, though her uncertainty lingered. Wine, it's the first gift you have given me. His gaze softened at that, but before he could respond, he leaned forward and took the flower from her ear with a quick, fluid motion. Wine gasped. Hey, what? He held it just out of her reach. Jungkook, but it looks a little too childish on you, don't you think? He said, trying to sound teasing. Vine's heart sank at his words. It meant so much to her, even if it was just a small, simple gesture. She hadn't expected him to take it away. Vine, give it back, she said. Her tone was firm, and she didn't realize, but this was the first time she was talking back to him. Jungkook raised an eyebrow, holding the flower just a bit higher, out of her reach. Jungkook, why? It doesn't look that great, Vine. Trust me, I'm doing you a favor. Vine, no, you're not. I want it back. Without thinking, Vine took a small step toward him, trying to grab it from his hand. Jungkook's smirk only deepened as he held it higher, clearly enjoying her attempts to reach it. Jungkook, come on, you're not going to catch me. She teased. Her frustration grew, and she moved closer, trying again, this time reaching for the flower more desperately. As she stepped forward again, she took the step too far, losing her balance and falling straight toward him. Jungkook immediately reached out to catch her without realizing, and Vine ended up stumbling into his lap. Both of their hearts skipped a beat as they froze for a moment. Vine's face turned bright red as she realized she was leaning against his chest, her hands braced on his shoulders for balance. Her breath caught in her throat, and for the first time, the distance between them felt smaller. Jungkook's arms instinctively wrapped around her waist to keep her from falling off. His heart raced in his chest, and he tried to ignore the heat spreading through his face. Jungkook, you're too stubborn, you know that? He murmured, trying to mask his own nervousness with humor. Vine could barely hear him over the pounding of her own heart. Vine, I just want the rose back. She was still trying to pull away, but feeling strangely grounded by his embrace. Jungkook didn't let go. He was too close to her, and his heart was beating wildly. Jungkook, okay, okay, he muttered, pulling the rose from his hand and placing it gently back in her ear. He brushed his fingers against her hair for a second, his touch staying more than he wanted to. Her breath caught in her chest again as she looked up at him, his face now even mere inches from her. His eyes were soft, but there was a deep warmth behind them that made her pulse race. Jungkook, you're impossible. Vine blinked, still trying to process everything. She didn't realize just how close they were until now, and her face flushed deeper. But she didn't pull away. She didn't know why, but it felt different this time. It didn't feel like she was in danger or out of place. It felt safe in a way. Vine, I just wanted to keep it. It means a lot to me. Jungkook, I didn't mean to upset you. I just thought it looked too innocent for someone like you. Vine, well, I'm not as tough as you think I am. His lips curled into a slight grin. I'm starting to see that. They stayed like that for a moment longer. Then he slowly pulled back, though he didn't let go of her completely. Jungkook, I didn't think you would fall on me like that. Pine rolled her eyes. I didn't plan on it, and she didn't even realize when she started talking to him without hesitation and feeling uncomfortable. He smiled and nodded towards the rose in her ear. Jungkook, I think it looks good on you. I was just being stubborn. Wine smiled, a soft laugh escaping her lips. Wine, I think it's cute. For the first time since they had met, Pine felt the tension between them ease. And while she was still unsure of what was happening between them, something inside her told her that maybe things weren't as scary as they seemed.